on that. Some companies use AI to affect the behavior of individuals or groups. So do some governments, as AI is a form of governance because it is a bureaucratic system. And how can we ensure that when it governs us, you and I maintain some control? So Dr. Henry Farrell, who argues, he will make the case for 10 minutes or so, 10 to 15 minutes, and then Kris Rose will compare his understanding of AI governance from his perch at Meta, and then around 10:30, we will open the floor to your questions. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Farrell. He is the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Agora Institute Professor of International Affairs, and Kris is the Director of Governance at a small company called Meta. Please proceed, Henry.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I guess that what I would like to do is to talk about where the idea of AI governance that I'm talking about came from, first of all. And this is really from a frustration that I and other people in the social sciences have had with the ways that people tend to think about AI. And so really what I think we see a lot is people talking about AI in terms of individual human intelligence. So the fundamental notion here is that we should think about AI as being an equivalent to individual human problem solvers in the ways that if humans try to figure stuff out, that AI is trying increasingly to emulate that, and that AI is eventually going to be in a place where perhaps it gets to the stage of AGI, or artificial general intelligence, which is supposed to be the stage at which it is as good as human beings, as individual human beings, across a wide variety of different tasks. And perhaps after that, we get to the stage of AI superintelligence. This is a vision which I think people have had in the AI world ever since AI really became a thing. We had a whole bunch of people, Eliezer Yudkowsky and other people who were interested in AI safety, arguing that we needed to be extremely careful about creating AI because this would then create this alternative form of intelligence with its own desires, with its own needs, which perhaps would learn how to manipulate human beings very quickly and then might effectively replace the entire human race. And then we had the optimistic version of this, which was taking from various science fiction writers this idea of what it would be like to be in a world where we had super intelligent AI whose only job was to look after us, to make life nice, so that we could basically goof off and have lots of fun while the AI took care of the tough, boring side of things for us. So this is, I think, a set of visions which people have had and which really dominates the AI debate, I think even still, although I think that is changing to some degree. So we have a lot of people, and here I think there are a lot of people in the AI labs, people like Dario Amodei, who is the head of Anthropic. We also see, of course, Sam Altman, who is the head of OpenAI. And we see Demis Hassabis, who is the guy who is in charge of Google's DeepMind, and Google's more general AI initiatives. And all of these people have different versions of this vision. And I think that from a social science perspective, the argument that we would make is that this really misconceives what AI actually is. And here, this is building on the work of great social scientists and also great computer scientists, people like Herbert Simon, for example, who spanned the two. And so instead of thinking about AI as an individual human intelligence, the argument goes that we should think about AI instead as a form of governance. And here the basic underlying notion is pretty straightforward. And if you read Herbert Simon, for example, he talks about this a lot. So human intelligence, individual human intelligence, actually is not that great. So we have these squishy organic brains, which have extremely limited individual processing power. They have all of these capacity gaps. And as a result of this, we have, over the last several centuries, begun to construct these much, much larger systems in which human beings collaborate and cooperate, but which in effect provide a kind of a massive tool of collective amplification, which allow us to solve problems collectively, which individually will be completely incapable of solving. And this can have wonderful effects. It can also have awful consequences. So here, for example, if you want to think about this, you can think about other governance arrangements, and by governance arrangements, I mean large-scale arrangements for complex problem solving. One of these big governance arrangements is the market. And so here we have Friedrich Hayek, who is one of the most famous economists, a Nobel Prize winner, a very famous right-wing economist, who argued that what the market does is not necessarily to provide efficiencies in the standard ways that econ textbooks suggest. Instead, he suggests that the market is an incredible system for dealing with complex tasks that would be simply impossible for any individual human being to do. So that, for example, so if you think about the way that an iPhone is assembled, you have all of these different manufacturers manufacturing all of these different components of the thing. You have hundreds or thousands of this, of different manufacturers. And obviously, there's a lot of planning that goes into assembling this, but also there is nobody who has the detailed knowledge of how all of the different parts are put together, what each individual part involves. And all you need, in a certain sense, in order to coordinate the whole thing, is you need to know what is the price at which an individual supplier is going to sell something, and whether or not you're prepared to pay that price. So you don't need to know anything about how, for example, the subcontractor, what their factories do, how they work, all of these things. The market, in a sense, allows you to coordinate using the price mechanism alone. And so, in effect, what it does is it takes this incredibly complex system of production, all of the detailed human knowledge that goes into making all of these individual bits and pieces, and it compresses them down into a system of prices which allow everybody to coordinate with each other. So this provides a very important form of governance. It provides a very important way in which human beings can come together to solve problems. And you can also make the same kind of argument about bureaucracy. Here, for example, James Scott argues that what bureaucratic rules do and bureaucratic standards is they take all of this valuable social knowledge, this informal knowledge that people have, and they compress it down into things that the state can see, that the government can understand, these simplified numbers, these simplified categories, which allow the government to see and to understand the world around it. And this means, as Scott points out, that the government has a terribly limited understanding of all of this stuff. There are many, many ways in which this can go terribly wrong. Equally, if you need to get large-scale tasks done, you need something like the government. You need something like these complex series of statistics, these bureaucratic categories that the government wants to fit everybody and everything in. You need all of these things to compress this complex form of information and to make it usable and to allow people to coordinate upon it. So then we have the state bureaucracy as one form of governance. We have markets as another form of governance. We could also talk about democracy in very similar ways. And so then the final argument is that if we want to think about AI, we should think about AI not as trying to become a single human intelligence or emulate it or become something which is super intelligent in the traditional way. Instead, the way in which AI works, and here in particular I'm referring to large language models and their cousins, is that they provide another new form of governance. And so what they do is they take all of these masses of cultural information that we have around us, these masses of information which are much, much too big for any individual human to process or to comprehend, and they make it accessible and tractable to us in new ways. So this is literally how a large language model works. It is large. It takes massive, massive amounts of textual information, textual knowledge. It then turns that textual knowledge into a set of mathematical vectors which can be processed through a particular kind of AI architecture called a transformer. And then after some extremely expensive training and effectively post-processing of this information, you now have this greatly shrunk down representation of all of this cultural knowledge, this cultural information, which you can apply in a variety of different ways. And so hence, so if we have in a certain sense something that does for cultural knowledge, what the market does for economic knowledge, and what bureaucracy does for social knowledge, that is, we have a system that can take all of this complex information, which is too big for anybody to grasp, and can squash it down into something that we can use. And this is crazy, this is new, this is fantastic, this is interesting, this is all sorts of potential good and bad consequences, but this is not actually individual super intelligence. So that is the fundamental argument that we might want to make if we want to talk about how it is that AI is a form of governance. So first of all, get away from the idea that it is supposed to be like individual human intelligence. Compare it instead to the kinds of collective systems that we have had in the past, such as markets and bureaucracies, which effectively allow human beings greatly to amplify their individual intelligence and to work together for good and for bad, and then begin to think about what this means when we're able to do this for the massive amounts of cultural knowledge that large language models, for example, can take advantage of, the massive amounts of visual knowledge that their cousins diffusion models can handle, and all of these other forms of cultural processing that we're beginning to see emerging with regard, for example, to audio, with regard to video. This is effectively a new form of effectively governing culture, making culture visible, making culture accessible, and allowing for new forms of remixing and new forms of knowledge as a result. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you so much, Henry. Okay, Kris is going to go next, but meanwhile, if you have questions, could you please put them in the Q&A? Thank you. Please, Kris.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much, Dr. Aaronson, for convening us, and Dr. Farrell. It was wonderful to hear your overview of your really fascinating paper, AI's Governance. I'm going to keep my observations very short because I'm really keen to jump into Q&A. But I'm also really excited for the discussion over the next half hour or so. So I wanted to lead with kind of a little bit of gratitude to Dr. Farrell for seeing what I think is an overlooked part of AI's what I think will be AI's transformative impact on society. As he points out, I think a lot of societal discourse right now has been focused on AI as a tool. And the individual use cases that are being marketed and being adopted across different sectors. So it's back to school season, and so one of the kind of primary ways that people are discussing how AI is being used is in school systems, and what we see is that AI very much is at a tipping point in school systems, both in adoption by students, which is maybe not so much of a surprise, but also by teachers and professors. And these are these types of immediate use cases that are being discussed as some of the most tangible and proximate ways that AI is impacting society. There's also a lot of discourse right now about how AI is being implemented at the workplace and the potential impact to the labor markets and workforces, how it's being a tool to improve productivity, but also to displace workers potentially. And there's lots of estimates about who's being displaced and what industries are the most exposed. But all of this discussion, as Dr. Farrell points out, is really limited to how AI is being used as a tool. And there are these kind of techno-optimists and techno-doomers that are forecasting how AI will be impacting these use cases. But what I'm glad to hear the conversation evolving to, and Dr. Farrell pointing to, is the more structural impact on society that this will have in how we organize ourselves, and indeed how information is organized. In Dr. Farrell's paper, I really enjoyed the term lossy but useful, but essentially how we might organize vast swaths of information and how that may change how humans interact with technology, but also how humans interact with one another. So building on some of his comments, I would just note that in some ways, technology um, as we observe, technology has already started to reshape how humans interact with one another and how we engage with one another. What we've seen is even through social media, as generations have continued to engage online, we are seeing evolutions of creativity. There was a recent report out by YouTube and Deloitte that talked about how culture has evolved, and how Gen Z and how they're interacting with content is much more collaborative, participatory, rather than previous generations that received entertainment through unidirectional content consumption. Now we see that young people in the United States are more frequently engaging and co-creating content, and that is actually giving shape to new forms of culture and entertainment than historically was the case. And so I think that that is one example of these kind of structural and cultural changes that we may see as AI becomes more mainstream, in that it will change how humans understand creativity and how humans organize one another and how they relate to both one another and the technology itself. And so I think in his paper, Dr. Farrell notes that key to really understanding how this will impact the structures of society and whether or not this will be a new dimension that builds on labor, bureaucracy, and democracy, we have to better understand also the limitations of AI. And so issues around bias and cultural representation are key among that. We know that AI is a product of the data that it's trained on, and the data on the internet is historically English language and produced by authors in the global north. And so that has an implication around what types of outputs AI offers and is not fully representative of user bases or populations across the world. And so there's a lot of questions around bias and ensuring that we have cultural representation. I was involved at in a project at Meta where we were looking at the homogeneity of outputs from AI and how we might actually make outputs from AI systems to be more heterogeneous and more representative of different populations around the world in terms of the cultural sensibilities that it reflects. And so these are going to be kind of huge impacts on and huge shaping factors for how AI impacts and the structures underneath us in society. And so I think this is really very helpful to look forward into the theoretical the theory of where AI may shape society. I think the question is how do we get ahead of that? How do we start to anticipate how other dimensions of governance like labor, bureaucracy, and democracy, how did they come to be shaped? And then how can we get ahead of some of the potentially unanticipated challenges that AI presents? So we already know that bias and representation in AI models is a challenge, but there are certainly unknown unknowns. And so I'm kind of keen to understand from political scientists what were the things that in our understanding of labor, bureaucracy, democracy, and these dimensions that we wish we would have known so that we can get ahead of that in the development of AI. And one way that we have at Meta tried to engage and get ahead of potential societal implications is through deliberative mini publics called community forums that we run in partnership with the Stanford Deliberative Democracy Lab to better understand societal interactions with AI, their expectations, and where potential societal impacts may emerge. And so this is kind of a part of multi-stakeholder engagement as we develop AI, all as a part of trying to anticipate where the technology's transformative potential and impact may land. So all this to say is I'm really excited to have the discussion, but I would note that I think that this is a really important and undercovered part of the discussion around AI. Right now, as Dr. Farrell pointed out, we are very much in the first order of impact of how AI is going to be a tool that augments or potentially some people say replaces individual intelligence. But collectively, how is the technology going to reshape the structures that underpin society and add to these dimensions of governance is a major question. I think my question for the academics and political scientists on this call is, what would we have wished we would have seen in these previous in the development of these previous dimensions, and therefore how can we potentially build that into how we're developing the technology of AI. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kris. Henry, do you want to respond?
I guess very quickly. So first, I would also like to say something which I should have said in the initial presentation, that if any of these ideas seem to you to at all be good ideas, they're probably the ideas of one of my collaborators rather than myself. So I am building here on a paper which was nominally single authored, but which really built upon an earlier paper published in Science, the journal, by Alison Gopnik, Cosmo Shalitzi, and James Evans and myself. And also, I should also point out other people like Marion Fourcade and Nate Matthias, and also Harry Hahn, who is a colleague of mine at Johns Hopkins. And we've written a paper together which is a little bit skeptical about the benefits of some of these deliberative mini-publics as a kind of, sort of more or less suggesting that we should be thinking about AI more generally in terms of its effects on democracy, and that democracy usually involves much more push and shove and power relations than I think, than I think a lot of the debate around AI and deliberation would suggest. So equally, and I think that this is really where we want to pay attention and really want to understand well what is happening, I think, is looking at some of the power shifts that are going to be consequent upon the more general diffusion of AI. I think that there are a lot of extremely complex questions that are going to emerge over who has power as effectively AI possibly becomes a set of cultural choke points. So if we see a world in which really we see convergence upon a relatively small number of models, then whoever is in charge of training those models, whoever is in charge of using reinforcement learning with human feedback and fine-tuning these models, whoever is in charge of constructing the invisible prompts that typically go together with people's queries, is going to have an awful lot of cultural power, an awful lot of power to shape people's understandings of what are the background ideas that everybody else has of what the knowledge is. And we've really only barely begun to scrape the surface of thinking through what this is going to look like, what this is going to involve. And here I think, and I should say that when I really started to begin to get interested in these questions, I went back to a piece which was written long before the current wave of large language models came into being, which is a piece written by Cosmo Shalitzi, who is a colleague of mine at Carnegie Mellon University. So he wrote a piece back in 2011, 2012, which is about this notion of the singularity, which is more or less, so this is the argument about AGI and about ASI, is this argument that is taken from science fiction writers about how it is that we are likely to head into a period of the future where we're going to see a rapid and profound transformation in the human condition as all of these non-human intelligences begin to spread, begin to proliferate, begin to build upon themselves. And so what Cosmo said, which I thought was a very, very important insight, is that this is something that has in fact already happened. That we are in fact living, rather than looking forward to a future singularity of AI, we should be looking back to the past singularity of the long industrial revolution that we have been living within for the last couple of centuries. The spread of market systems, the spread of mechanization, the spread of bureaucracy, all of these systems, they have these extraordinary promises and also these extraordinary threats. There is a reason why Franz Kafka is a great novelist, and the reason why is that Kafka is the person who really more explicitly than anybody else explained what it was like to be on the wrong side of those systems. So we have this world which, where we now have a new form of massive distributed intelligence that has come into being. And so I think that, so to answer the point, I think that it's extremely difficult to anticipate what are the particular features of AI that are going to have consequences. But what we also know is that the Industrial Revolution effectively spawned the social sciences as they exist today. Political science, economics, sociology, anthropology, even in some important senses, history, they are all, in a certain sense, they are responses to the shockwave of the old Industrial Revolution. So I really think that if we want to build up a better understanding, we need almost a new social science discipline, which is as to AI, is as to these new technologies, in the same relationship that economics is to markets, that political science is to politics, and so on, that is to democratic systems, that in a sense is specialized in the study of what are the social, political, and cultural consequences of these new technologies, in conversation with the engineers who are, of course, creating these technologies, and with some understanding of the technical details of how they work, but focusing on a very, very different set of questions in order to build up the kinds of expertise that we absolutely need to have if we're going to be able to really cope with this extraordinary new world which is unfolding around us.
Did you want to add anything, Kris?
No, I would love to get
I
into
want
Q&A.
to.
It was very helpful. It was a really helpful several points from Dr. Farrell. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to just make a point from our own research, which is we see this weird contradiction. On one, maybe it's not a contradiction, but it is confounding, which is on one hand, governments are increasingly adopting AI without public consent, and that's everywhere. On the other hand, from our research, we see very few people participate in governance of AI questions, and it tends to be the same old people that are on advisory committees. So we see very little, like less than 0.01 of citizens, whether it's Australia, Canada, the United States. You know, we were shocked to see the 10,000 responses to the Trump AI action plan. And statistically, those people are not very diverse. They tend to be in the sector. So the general public has not woken up to this. Okay, I will shut up now and we'll begin with the questions from the audience. So the first question is, since you mentioned how AI can be looked as a kind of cultural informant or mirror of sort, how would you like to address AI often makes quite large simplification of knowledge? How does it affect the structuralism of AI governance?
Okay,
not, yeah.
I guess that question is aimed at me. So I think that what it does, the crucial thing to understand is it makes it effectively is a vast engine of summarization. And summarization means brutally that you throw a bunch of information out. And this is one of the reasons why many forms of large language models have been subject to hallucinations, is that they do not have a complete model of the information that they have been trained upon. And they are optimized, in effect, to provide highly plausible continuations of the text. So what they do is they more or less they sort of try to figure out, given what has been said already, what comes next. And if they are not basing this on existing specific knowledge that has survived through the training process, they're going to come up with some extremely plausible guess instead. And so this is going to have, I think, some very interesting consequences as it is applied sort of within bureaucracies and within other structures, because we can see LLMs as providing, on the one hand, an extraordinary set of tools for allowing organizations to know what they know. This has been one of the fundamental problems, of course, of every big organization. So if you think about the US government, probably locked in some filing cabinet somewhere or another, for any problem, there's probably a lot of interesting and useful and valuable information. Large language models make it possible to search for that information in ways that simply weren't possible before. Also, and this is something which is similarly, I think, underappreciated as a use of large language models, they also serve as a means of bureaucratic translation. So I remember having a conversation with somebody who was a former very senior official in the Department of Defense who talked about how half of this person's life was spent trying to figure out his people spent half their lives trying to figure out how to translate stuff from the language of one branch of the armed services into another branch of the language of another branch of the armed services, and that is a tedious and painful task. It is also the kind of thing which large language models can be automated to do extremely well. But equally, we face all of these we face all of these possible problems that we have to think about as well, which is that you by and large want bureaucratic machineries to be relatively accurate in the knowledge that they draw upon. And if we're in a world where some of the decisions that they make are based upon hallucinations of one sort or another, this creates new possible means for injustice at the local and individual level, which we need to think about. And we also need to think about the fact that in a certain sense, large language models, they are trained in a rather static way. There are ways in which you can work around this to some degree by using this method called RAG, which allows you to introduce more recent information and other forms of information. But you really are stuck with the, you're stuck with this past understanding of the world, which is based upon a kind of a marrying together of tacit information with data, of transformation of tacit information into data. And that can also mean that it is that organizations, to the extent that they over rely upon these technologies, may be stuck in the past, or may be stuck in may be less capable of responding adaptively and creatively. And here I think the most interesting example of this may be an authoritarian regime such as China. So if we think about Xi's China, reportedly, there is a large language model which is really an instantiation of Chairman Xi thought. So that if, and you can think about this as being extremely useful from an ideological perspective, there is a lot of stuff that Xi has said, or at least has allowed to go out under his name as stuff that he has said, but there is only so much. So if you're trying to apply to an entirely new problem what Chairman Xi would want, this technology allows you to do that quite well. And this is, again, this is a process of, in a sense, cultural translation. Crudely speaking, what the large language model is capable of doing is bringing together, so say Chairman Xi has not said anything about the problem of how to deal with sewage in provincial cities, and you need to figure out what to do with the sewage system. This can add together the vectors associated with Chairman Xi's general ideology, plus the vectors associated with knowledge over sewage systems, and come up with some plausible approximation of what Xi would say. But equally, that can mean that if you are a bureaucrat in the People's Republic of China, it might actually have been better for you to be capable of coming up with your own, quote, interpretation, unquote, of what Chairman Xi would have said, so that you can apply all sorts of specific local information, which doesn't make it into either of these statistical approximations. So I do wonder whether we're going to see, in a sense, an increase in the role of bureaucratic ritual and a decrease in the capacity of people to move away from that ritual, even in circumstances where it is clear that the best approach would be for them to do so. And this is something that Marion Fourcade, who I mentioned, and I have written about. We had a piece in The Economist last year, and we're hoping to pursue this at greater lengths in other work.
Thank you, Henry. Kris, did you want to add anything there?
No.
Okay. All right, Kris, we're going to have a question for you here, which is basically, what is the responsible AI profession going to look like?
Yeah, it's a good question because it's evolving, right? So we are really we're riding the wave of the earliest set of adoption and the earliest set of challenges around responsible AI. And there's a lot of questions about what are the roles and the responsibilities of governments, companies, independent bodies like the security safety institutes, and then users themselves, right? And so I was just reading this morning an article about OpenAI's recent changes to prevent youth and teen self-harm using ChatGPT. And so I think the question around responsible AI is evolving, right? You have like the most kind of proximate concerns are around chatbots' influence on human behavior and their influence over individuals. Those are obviously, edge cases that are highly sensational, but they're real world harm. But then you have a deeper and more structural question around all of the questions that Dr. Farrell was mentioning, which is what are the bodies of data that are underpinning this this technology? And if you are an organization that is using your own proprietary data, that will have a skew. But even for foundational models, the data will potentially skew humans' understanding of truth. And so I think there's many different layers of what responsibility looks like, and there's very much a debate at the government level, as well as at the societal level of how of where the appropriate boundaries are. And so we are. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Susan.
No, I wasn't saying
Oh, sorry.
anything.
I thought I heard someone.
Someone raised their hand, but that person needs to put their question in the Q&A. Sorry.
Chat. But I think that's actually part of, I mean, we're living through this process right now, and it's one of the reasons why we have opted to expand the aperture for the types of input we're receiving as a company, for example. So we do have, advisory bodies, we engage with regulators, but this is one of the reasons why we have started to engage users in a much more dedicated and rigorous way. And I take all the points that Dr. Farrell noted in his other article titled AI and Democratic Publics and the limitations of kind of ad hoc engagement, and that democracy functions best when there's a sustained model of engagement, and when there's a push and pull. I think that that's right. And I hope that our model of engagement with the public can continue to evolve and mature. But this is one of these reasons why we have to better understand where our societies and also governments, the parameters for what constitutes responsibility. So I know that the question was, what does the field of responsible AI look like? I know that wasn't necessarily a clear and crisp answer, but I think that the honest answer is that this is a space that we're still determining. And you can over the past couple of years, we've seen a range of different experiments, all the way from what was a really high profile set of issues coming from the initial release of Google Gemini, where the company indexed around issues like equity and found that the outputs were incoherent. But we also know that we need to ensure that we're building some sort of safeguards, and so that this field is really still quite evolving.
Thank you, Kris. So a question is for Henry, I think here. Taxpayers fund bureaucracies, market participants constitute fund markets. How is AI governance different?
Okay, so I think that AI governance, and this is a very interesting question, is AI governance effectively is primarily a private sector thing at the moment. It is a complicated private sector thing. It is a weird private sector thing, but it is a private sector thing. So if you go back to the early days, for example, of OpenAI, you see this public declaration, more or less, that because AI was such a risky technology, you couldn't treat it according to standard commercial incentives, because the risk and the fear would be that if you treat it as a business proposition, that people would be willing to put risky models out into the public in order to make money. Therefore, it needed to be treated using the model of a nonprofit. Then, of course, it turns out, however, that if you want to train up these models, it costs a ton of money. And that requires capital, and by and large, people who are providing you with capital want a return on it. So you see this move in OpenAI from that to a capped profit model, which is a kind of a hybrid between a non-profit and a pure profit-making entity. And now we also saw a lot of debate internally, and we saw people leaving for Anthropic because they felt that that Sam Altman bluntly was not sort of as worried about the downside risks as he ought to be. And now Anthropic, of course, has also, in order to keep going as an entity, has become, I think, somewhat softer on some of the AI risk things that it used to worry about, and much more enthusiastic about the possibilities. So I think that the short answer is, at the moment, the governance system is a governance system which is responsive to the primarily to the very, very large amounts of capital that have been invested in. It is responsible to specific shareholders. The initial vision was that this was going to be something which would be insulated from business imperatives and from the profit imperative, at least to some degree. But this has increasingly been watered down, and this creates, I think, all of these very complicated questions about the extent to which these kinds of things should be in the private sector. Equally, we're seeing I think, weird amalgams beginning to emerge between the private sector and government, especially in the Trump administration, which appears to, this is very much a ongoing question. As the US government begins to adopt these technologies internally, as the US government begins to become much more explicit than I think past administrations have been in saying who are the winners and who are the losers, and punishing businesses which do not get on board with the government's perspective, we're seeing a very, very different role or relationship of governance emerging. And I really, again, this is something that I think people need to pay a lot more attention to, but there simply aren't enough people who are studying and thinking about this in the right way. I think in large part because this is such a new set of questions, but what you might call the political economy of AI. This is something I'm teaching a master's course on at the moment. There are very, very few people who are even beginning to think systematically about this, and the kinds of information, the kinds of data, the kinds of detailed understanding that you would want to have in order to map out the particulars of the kinds of problems that I've just described. You have some very good journalism, but from an academic research perspective, there just isn't the there yet that there needs to be.
Thank you.
Susan, can I build on that
Yes,
just maybe a little bit?
please.
And I'd be curious for Susan, your perspective, Dr. Farrell, your perspective, but I guess I don't disagree with what you mentioned, but it does seem like there's more than just corporations involved in AI governance. You obviously mentioned the government. I guess one way we have looked at it is that this is still quite nascent, as I mentioned, just like the field of responsible AI, that we're 2 years into the era where generative AI has really taken off. We see it as kind of, I think I kind of see it as nascent, but also more substantial, even though it's lacking kind of really clear roles and responsibilities. So it seems like we need to calibrate this governance ecosystem, but it does seem like we're seeing, obviously, as you noted, the internal corporate structure. So OpenAI is kind of evolving corporate structure, and Anthropic's is a PBC, a public benefit corporation. But we're also seeing different advisory bodies stand up that are commissioned by those individual companies, but also cross-industry collaborations like the Partnership on AI, the ML Commons, and the Frontier Model Forum. And I think in addition to government and these types of corporate structures, corporate advisory bodies, independent advisory bodies, this is why I think user inputs are really important. And what seems to be missing is kind of a clarity around roles and responsibilities. And I understand that a lot of that is also because there's incoherent or inconsistent government policy across the world, and governments are still trying to kind of organize themselves. But in my mind, it's more than just corporations acting alone. And maybe I misinterpreted what you were saying, but it does seem like there are more actors moving into this space. But what is lacking in clarity is exactly specific roles and responsibilities, and anything that's really particularly binding in this space right now.
So maybe if I can respond briefly. So I guess I come at this from a different perspective, which is that I'm not somebody who's deeply engaged in the world of AI governance as traditionally understood. And when I think about these relationships, I tend to think about them, to return to what I said at the beginning, in terms of sort of bluntly and brutally of power relations, of who has that I think that in the end of the day, the questions of governance, to some extent, they have to do with which norms are set, but they also have to do with who has the power to do what. And here I think that there is as I was trying to articulate, perhaps not particularly well, there's something new and there's something that is worth paying attention to in the Trump administration's approach. So when I think about governance under the Biden administration, I think about some of the things that they tried to do through sort of effectively setting the agenda through policy documents. But I also think about the way in which the Biden administration, in its dying days, tried to use semiconductors and the semiconductor choke point as a means effectively to impose a system upon the world, saying who would have access to frontier models, who would not have access to frontier models, who would be able to train them. So effectively trying to create a system under which the Biden administration would figure out who got what. And the Trump administration, I think we are seeing, on the one hand, there is much less interest very clearly in some of the governance and harm prevention stuff that there used to be, except there are some particular areas such as child, such as some sort of child and sort of exploitation, which they continue to be interested in. But there very clearly is a sense there that so the Trump administration is more or less explicitly saying we do not want nearly as much regulation as there was, but there also is a sense that the Trump administration is very explicitly saying we still want the United States to dominate the production and to dominate AI and to be the dominant power in figuring out how these things happen. So my read on governance, which I will absolutely recognize as a different take than 90% of people who have AI and governance in the title of what they do, is that the more important set of questions to look at are less the intra-industry standard-making bodies and much more who has sort of the power relations that are and the jostling between governments, between sort of big corporate entities which have a lot more power than they have ever had before, but equally which have to answer to governments when push comes to shove, because governments have a monopoly over the use of power, have a monopoly over the use of force. And this, for me, is really where at least my bets are put as to where you want to pay attention as to what is going to happen next.
Well, I'll be brief. I look at institutions and ideas and how they change over time. And I disagree with you, Henry, in that corporations have a ton of power in the AI space, whether it is by not giving out or sharing AI models, whether they're open source or proprietary, how much they cooperate with the government and how much they sort of push back. So we're looking at the difference between NVIDIA and maybe Microsoft. How much I think they have NVIDIA as example has basically fueled the AI sovereignty model, and I find that quite dangerous and disturbing. And that there isn't this bottom-up perspective. That really worries me. If you look at how institutions developed over time in the 18th, 19th century, there was whether it came from groups of business people or enlightened progressive leaders, there is this bottom-up thing. Whereas with AI, you do not really see that. And the United States has, I think, unfortunately adopted that government is bad and anti-governance culture. And what the Biden administration did was terrible because it tried to curb the power, through antitrust. Although at the same time, the FTC said, we don't need new rules. We have all the tools we need to protect consumers. So it is evolving, as you said, but it isn't democratic. One more diss, if I may, which is sort of PR for Michael and I, but we have a study on what companies say about responsible AI, what their technical documents say, and then how chatbots respond to questions related to responsible AI, and unfortunately, this is bullshit. It's like corporate social responsibility. There's no one in the company responsible for it who makes it consistent. Okay, I'm going to shut up and let's go back to our questions because we have a few. Can you guys stay for like 5 more minutes past 11, or is that a problem?
I
Fine
can
by
stay.
me.
Okay, this question is about LLMs in the workplace. Can you give more concrete examples of AI as governance in a practical sense, thinking about agentic AI? Henry, do you want to go first?
I think you're on mute.
Okay, so this is about AI in the workplace and governance. So I think that one of the interesting questions is, to what extent does this transform bureaucracy? So as I've mentioned, so one way in which you can think about this is in terms of all of the things that bureaucracy will be able to do that it wasn't capable of doing before by transforming a lot of the information that has been held in various bits and pieces into things that you can, into actionable information in a way that has not been possible before. And this is not just about large language models. This is also about other models that, for example, can pull together quantitative data and try to figure out patterns in ways that we haven't, that we haven't had before. So you can look at this in positive and in negative ways. The positive ways are that this enables governments to fill a lot of the cracks and the holes that they haven't been capable of doing between different pieces, different parts of their knowledge. They can work across areas of data in order to identify problems or stress points that they haven't seen before in order better to serve citizens. The downside is also that they can sort of fill cracks and problems and blank spots in their knowledge that they haven't been able to fill before. So this is an argument that, for example, Kieran Healy and Marion Fourcade have made, that what we are seeing, that a lot of citizen freedoms effectively depend upon the incapacity of government to put the different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together in a way that gives them a complete vision of what citizens are doing, that allows citizens to do a lot of stuff that governments can't necessarily put their finger on because they're not able to unite their knowledge together. And exactly to the extent that AI makes governments more capable of doing this for good stuff. You can see this sort of happening with regard to bad stuff as well. And here I think it would be particularly useful to look at some of the ways, for example, in which Palantir is offering to provide the government with systems that will allow them to integrate data from a variety of different sources together, including, as best as we can tell from the contracts that Palantir has been offered, including going after non-documented people in ways that simply have been difficult to do before. So I think that that is the kind of governance question that we want to think about very specifically. You can see, as I say, ways in which this could be used for the benefit of citizens. You can also see ways in which a government can use this in a very, very adversarial way against citizens and against non-citizens, joining the dots together in a way that it hasn't been capable of doing before.
Kris, did you want to add anything here?
Nope.
Okay. Sorry. Okay, so I just lost the Q&A. Okay. State governments are trying to address harmful online interactions. I think the First Amendment concerns are legitimate, but I also agree that content is harming. Could you give some examples of governance that could be pursued in this scenario related to online harms? Or does anyone feel uncomfortable with that?
No, I don't feel uncomfortable with it. I'm just, I think and I apologize. I was thinking between social media and AI, but I think what we're seeing, right, is this a range of different state efforts and also, nation state level efforts to address potentially harmful content. And so in Europe, for example, you have the DSA that stipulates certain requirements at a systemic level that platforms have to address, and that's more on the traditional social media side of content. In terms of AI content, we're seeing a kind of a proliferation of requirements that are proposed. I think the question is, not only how do you what are the right parameters for the state to be prescribing, but also what are the content policies that are emerging from these models. And so what we've seen is a really fascinating series of efforts about how should platforms be prescribing content policies. And OpenAI recently, I think it was in late August, released another one of their experiments regarding how public inputs have started to shape their content policies around what constitutes potential harms. It's called collective alignment, and it is informing their model specs of some of their content policies. And so the idea being that by crowdsourcing an understanding of the highest risk types of content, it can help inform what content policies should be, because there will be always this pushback in the U.S. around the First Amendment, right? And so how should platforms be kind of drawing those lines on issues that may be relevant for people, but also borderline. So there was the instance of a man in, I believe it was Texas, but I can't remember, but who asked for advice on cutting sodium out of his diet. And he asked ChatGPT that, and in the end, he ended up poisoning himself unintentionally based on the advice he received from ChatGPT. Regular diet advice is not something that it like jumps out to people as a potential area of harm. But what you can see is that there's certain edge cases where it could harm someone. Now, should ChatGPT not have the ability to provide diet guidance to people, particularly adults, is a question. So all this to say is that some of these parameters, like there are some state efforts, there are some nation state level efforts, but in the end, the platforms are going to have to make some of these decisions. And the question is how are those decisions made? Are they made by the platforms alone? And what we're starting to see is some efforts by both Anthropic as well as OpenAI to understand to help the public actually provide input in how they should be doing that. I don't know if that exactly answered the question. I'm happy to follow up if it wasn't helpful.
Thank you, Kris. I'm sorry you didn't mention the oversight board there too, because that's an important model.
Yeah, well, I can mention that, and again, that's on social media, but certainly a question around what are some independent oversight bodies that could come to bear in the AI space, right? So Meta established the oversight board in 2020 when we were then Facebook, but enshrined a external independent body with binding oversight over content decisions. And again, that was on social media. But as this governance ecosystem continues to evolve, the question may be as platforms make decisions around content policies for AI, what type of independent check is there, and are bodies like the oversight board needed in that instance? Thank you, Susan, for raising that.
Thank you, guys. Okay, so Henry, did you want to make any final comments?
Just one comment which talks about the difficulties of some of the of actually implementing some of the content policies, which is that technically this can often be complicated. I mean, Kris mentioned the Google Gemini story, where what you have is you have an image generator, which is effectively told to provide highly representative pictures, so that it isn't just sort of smiling white dudes and sort of in all of the pictures that it generates. And so this then generates so this is probably done using some form of prompt engineering, if my memory is correct. But the prompts that they use then sort of generate African Americans as Nazi stormtroopers and in other guises, because it's extremely difficult to if you're trying to push the model in one direction, it is probably going to produce a whole bunch of unexpected content of other sorts. And the other side of this, it's what we saw a couple of months ago with Grok, the LLM that Elon Musk uses, where he reportedly had instructed it to be less woke and to to effectively to take contrarian positions on a variety of things. And and this then results in Grok declaring itself to be a quote Mecha Hitler unquote, to saying sort of surfacing a lot of the really vile content that it has been trained on about anti-Semitism. And but the point here being that trying to push the model in one direction or another without a huge amount of extremely expensive and tricky and intricate engineering is probably going to lead to a whole lot of unexpected consequences that you didn't particularly, that you didn't particularly anticipate as a result of your desire to push the model in one way or another. So I think it resembles the kinds of standard moderation problems that social media companies have always had, but it adds a whole new technical layer of complications on top of that.
Thank you. Kris, any final comments?
No.
Okay, guys, I apologize that we didn't have time to get to everyone's questions, but I want to thank you so much for coming. And please join me in thanking our excellent speakers, Dr. Henry Farrell, Kris Rose. Look at all that. Thank you so much, everybody. And we welcome your ideas for other webinars. And if you want to do this again, I'll try to chat with Kris and Henry and see if we can do it again in 6 months or so. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a lovely week. Bye. Thank you.